And welcome back to the channel today with something a little bit different, because today I will show you how the burial blade works. Now if you want to see this thing in action, a link to that video is in the description and in the end card. But before we begin, a couple of tips for those of you who want to make something like this yourself. First off, if you're making this from metal, this up here is an actual sword, so read up on all the safety instructions for handling swords and blades. These can hurt you faster than you might think. Other than that, the mechanism on this entire thing is anything but safe for the user. So keep in mind, when this thing opens, the pommel will travel at a very high velocity, powered by a very strong spring, and anything or anyone that gets hit by it is sure to have a bad day. Other than that, there are a billion little spots on this one where you can bruise or cut yourself, so if you're trying to make something like this, be careful and be safe. I don't want to read any comments that somebody got hurt. But with that, let's get to the video. But before we can begin the disassembly, we first need to remove the bandages and the wrapping around the handle up here and down here. Down here at the axis, you want the wrapping of the handle to fit loosely, because the spring moves a bit outwards whenever the handle opens and closes. Now we just quickly remove this string. This should be enough already. Now we pull this back. What you can see here is the main spring. This spring basically is what opens the handle. It works by running along something like a piston. There's a piece of pipe that comes from up here and is attached to the lower handle half right here. The other end of the piston is a piece of all thread, because we need this nut over here to adjust the strength of the spring. The all thread itself is held in place by two machine screws here and on the other side. And here you can see that the piston has a hole for the screws we just unscrewed. Basically they go down up to the middle from both sides and then keep the piston in place. We take the handle apart by unscrewing the nut and screw. You can see here they're on both sides. And then they come apart like this. Here we have the axis. It basically consists of a special nut like this. There's thread on the inside. This diameter out here is basically what fits perfectly into the lower handle half hole. And the other side is this machine screw with a piece of pipe on here. And this diameter fits perfectly into the hole on the upper handle half. And when they are screwed together, they look something like this. And so they ensure the least amount of rattle between the two handle halves. Here is the lower handle half again, and now we can remove the main spring from the piston with a bit of rattle and force. The first thing I want to take a look at is the pommel of the lower handle half. It's basically just a weight made to look like the one in the game. but it has this hook down here that is very important for the function of the piece. So remember this for later. On the other side of the lower handle half we have this contraption. First off, you can see here the one half of the piston I showed you that runs through the main spring. Very important is the distance between this point of contact and the middle point of the axis, because as you can see, if you make the distance too short, it won't work. Now the other important technical elements are those surfaces here and down here. One thing that might not be immediately obvious, even though I feel like you can see it pretty well from this angle, this corner down here has the same distance to the center point as this corner up here. That ensures that the handle can open and close without interfering on this side. This up here, there's a corresponding surface on the other handle half, and those basically guarantee that the handle cannot overextend above the point where it's completely open. Because with this much material behind it, there's no way that anything bends out of shape. This surface down here is for the little catch that keeps the thing opened as long as it's locked. But I will show you that one on the other half. And here we have the other half of the axis mechanism. Not much to see at first. But once I turn it... Damn, that's heavy. What you can see back here is the surface I explained a second ago that rests against those surfaces, like so. And this down here is the catch I just mentioned. As you can see, it can retract. Once it's fully extended by spring power, it will keep the handle open. And when you try to close the handle, this steel wire pulls on the catch and will retract it. I will explain where the steel wire goes to in a second. And with that, on to the last part of the handle, the head. To open up the head, we need to remove 5 screws. Two up here, then 2 down here, and a little tiny one back here. Now we can unscrew this. Little fun fact I only noticed a couple of weeks ago. This side here not having a nut is only on the player version of the Burial Blade. Garmin's Burial Blade has a nut here. Now we can move this piece out, take the disc out, and then we can carefully remove the side plate. The first thing I want to show you is this disc I just took out. I hinted at it already in my Resident Evil 4 Remake knife making video. This disc is made out of 2 separate discs. They are welded together along the sides and then grinded over. The first disc is pretty simple. It's just a regular disc with a isometric M8 thread tapped through. But the second side is a little bit more complicated. Now first off, there's this little channel for the blade to go into. Also, there is this cutout for the arm that rotates the disc. And then we have this tiny little, very important notch down here that looks like a welding problem on camera. But trust me, it's there on purpose. Here we have the side plate I took off earlier. It's a good way to show you how the blade is attached to the handle. You can see those two channels over here. This is the back end and this is the front side. And on the blade handle, we have those two lugs. They are basically the only thing I had to add to the design from the video game to make this thing work. Even though, debatably, this one might even be on the real thing. This one's definitely an added one. But once the bandages are on here, they pretty much disappear to the eye. Now, to attach the blade, you slide the back one in and slide the front one down. And this is basically the only way you can remove this thing, which makes it relatively safe while using, because there's no way this thing can move anywhere except in the intended direction. Also, you can see this is where the disc I just showed you fits in, between those two plates. Back here you can see the other disc. Can't rotate very far because it's on a piece of all thread, but it doesn't need to rotate very far. It has enough travel as is. As I mentioned earlier, the head is now in the locked position, or in the scythe configuration. And to understand how all of that works, I will just simply push this lever over here and basically reset it to the sword configuration. Now, the first important step that we need to understand for this to work is, in sword configuration, the two channels from the handle and the discs are aligned. This is important because otherwise you can't fit the blade in here. So, if you put the blade in here, first back here, then up front here. Now when you insert the blade here, it will push on this little detent, this spring-powered detent. You can see the spring back here. Hopefully you can see it. This is a bit confusing. The reason I cannot take this apart any further is because there's a lot of fine-tuning to all of those pieces, and last time it took me half a day to get everything into the right position, so I hope you can understand why I won't take all of this apart. Also, for showing the function, it's easier if everything is in place. Now, as said, once it pushes on this little detent, the nose down here will push on this lever down here. And when that happens, it looks a little something like this. Now, this entire mechanism is basically powered by this big beefy spring down here. And the way this works, it's attached to this seesaw that runs over this angle here. This is basically a right angle. And these arms here are connected to the discs I showed you earlier. As you can see, this is the cutout where the arm fits perfectly into. with a little stud that it latches onto. Something like this. And when this little detent pushes on this lever and moves this slider down, what happens is those catches move downwards, and those tiny little locking corners I showed you earlier, those tiny ones down here, oh, that's a good angle, they are basically no longer catching, and the discs can rotate, which in turn allows this spring to move the seesaw down via those arms. And that in turn moves this arm. Whoop. And that in turn moves this arm up. That's the other end of the seesaw. And basically rotate the discs back here. So all of the 4 discs move at the same time. This will also become important for unlocking later. The other thing that this slider moves is this little catch down here. And that is the catch that holds onto the lower end of the second handle half. I showed you this hook down here earlier. And when the catch moves down, the handle can move outwards. If you want to return to sword mode, what you do is you pull this lever back here. This mainly does 2 very important things. First off, this piece of duct tape you can see here covers the end of a steel wire that runs through the handle, and that is connected to the little locking catch I showed you earlier at the axis. And by pulling this wire all the way through the handle upwards, it unlocks this catch and actually allows this handle to be folded again. This was probably the most complicated part to get into the right position. It took me, I'd say, probably about half a day to get the exact same length. If you make it too long, it doesn't unlock. If you make it too short, you can no longer reset all of this, and it was a huge hassle. Let's just put it like that. Now the other thing that happens, the discs rotate back into alignment with the handle. This first off means that you can now remove the blade. Secondly, it means that this little notch I keep mentioning is now aligned with this catch again. So this entire thing is now locked in the open position and cannot just simply close again. This would be the situation you had on your hands after you folded the handle again. The blade would still be in here. And the last step is, once you remove the sword, the little trigger that activates the entire mechanism resets. That's why this lever is spring-loaded. And you have those ramps. What's also a bit fiddly to get those right, but nothing really impossible.
Now I hope you found this video interesting, and I will hopefully see you in the next one.